On October 16, 1941, in Moscow, a chilling rain descended upon Makovsky Square. Amidst this downpour, Nikolai Bulganin, destined to become the Soviet premier, but then merely a functionary of middling rank, observed a chaotic scene. Citizens were shattering the storefronts of a provisions market. Their action stemmed not from acute deprivation, but from sheer apprehension. The Wehrmacht, the German military, was less than 60 miles distant, and the populace of Moscow was acutely aware that the central government was commencing an evacuation. Railroad carriages, laden with functionaries, crucial state papers, and the nation's gold reserves, were already en route eastward towards Kuzbyshev. Industrial machinery was being systematically dismantled and transported to the Urals. The Lenin mausoleum had been emptied, its preserved occupant spirited away for safekeeping. In the disarray born of this stark realization, Moscow was fragmenting internally. Bulganin watched as a woman, clad in a wool coat, hurled a brick through the window of a bakery. Others surged forward in her wake. A uniformed law enforcement officer stood 30 feet away, an impassive spectator, taking no action. What indeed was the purpose? The enemy was approaching. This was the prevailing sentiment. The radio transmissions had ceased at the behest of higher authority. In this pervasive silence, unsubstantiated whispers morphed into established fact. The National Socialists, it was rumored, would arrive within days, perhaps hours. Each person for themselves. Yet one figure remained, Joseph Stalin. He sat in his office within the Kremlin, a mere 2 miles from Bulganin's vantage point, observing his city's descent into pandemonium. He had been there throughout the morning, receiving updates that progressively clarified the dire circumstances. The Western Front was disintegrating. German armored vehicles were advancing rapidly towards the capital from multiple vectors. Soviet contingents were either capitulating or vanishing without a trace. Ivan Konev, commander of the Western Front, could not even definitively ascertain the precise locations of his own troops. For the preceding 4 months, Stalin had witnessed his preconceptions regarding the conflict, his army, and his own decision-making proved disastrously erroneous. It had commenced on the 22nd of June, when 3 million German soldiers breached the Soviet frontier in an unprecedented invasion. Stalin had steadfastly convinced himself this would not transpire. He had entered into a non-aggression accord with Hitler 2 years prior, ostensibly to gain time and prepare, or so he had believed. In the late 1930s, he had purged his military of perceived dissenters, executing 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and 57 out of 85 corps commanders. He had eliminated those deemed weak, disloyal, or unreliable. Concurrently, he had eradicated the majority of his seasoned military leadership. The repercussions became glaringly evident in the initial weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Soviet units surrendered in staggering numbers, not out of cowardice, but because their leaders, inexperienced junior officers elevated beyond their capabilities, operated within a system that penalized initiative and mandated execution for any deviation from orders. German forces encircled entire Soviet armies. At Kiev alone, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. At Minsk, 300,000. At Smolensk, an additional 300,000. By October, the Germans had inflicted casualties or captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. They had penetrated 500 miles into Soviet territory. And now, With Operation Typhoon, they were launching their final assault on Moscow. Stalin bore the responsibility for this crisis, and he was acutely aware of it. Georgy Zhukov, the sole Soviet general who had demonstrated genuine competence, presented Stalin with an unvarnished account on October 10th. The Western Front was finished. Moscow would fall unless immediate, decisive action was taken. Every available reserve, every unit that could be scraped together from other fronts was imperative. Time was of the essence. Stalin appointed Zhukov as commander of the Western Front and posed the singular, crucial question. "Are you certain we can defend Moscow?" Zhukov, a stocky man with a forthright demeanor and no inclination for political maneuvering beyond stark honesty, met the Soviet leader's gaze and admitted his uncertainty, yet stressed the necessity of the attempt. Stalin made his definitive choice that evening. The government would be evacuated. The foreign diplomatic missions would depart. The industrial facilities would be relocated. However, he would remain. He would stay in Moscow, visible, present, embodying the might of the Soviet Union within its capital. He communicated this decision to his closest confidants on October 15th. Vyacheslav Molotov, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, deemed it suicidal. Lavrenti Beria, his secret police chief, was already formulating plans for a government in exile. Yet Stalin remained resolute. If he were to depart, Moscow would succumb not to German tanks, but to widespread panic and disintegration. The city would tear itself apart before the first panzer unit arrived. His premonition proved accurate. The subsequent morning, October 16th, Moscow plunged into turmoil. With the government in flight and no clear directives issued to the populace, citizens anticipated the worst-case scenario. Shops were plundered. Officials set fire to documents in the streets, filling the air with ash and the acrid scent of burning paper. Market prices plummeted as individuals frantically attempted to sell their possessions for any sum. A grand piano fetched 100 rubles, a fur coat 50. People were either preparing for flight, bracing for death, or simply resigning themselves to the end of their known world. Into this maelstrom, Stalin injected himself. He convened a meeting of the State Defense Committee and declared his intention to remain. More than that, he vowed to restore order. Looters would be executed summarily. The NKVD would reestablish control. Anyone propagating panic would be apprehended. Furthermore, on November 7th, Revolution Day, a military parade would proceed in Red Square, as was customary annually, as if no extraordinary circumstances were unfolding. His subordinates regarded him as having lost his faculties. The enemy forces were a mere 50 miles away. Their reconnaissance units had reached the town of Khimki, close enough for German officers to discern the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. The weather had turned exceptionally severe. Heavy snowfalls blanketed the landscape. The mud that had impeded the German advance in October was now freezing into an iron-hard, rutted terrain that shredded vehicle suspensions. Yet the Germans persisted, their advance unwavering, still believing that one final exertion would breach the Soviet capital. Stalin, however, understood something his subordinates did not. The battle for Moscow would not be won solely by materiel. It would be won by resolve. The Soviet edifice was maintained by an outward display of strength, by the projection of inevitable triumph, and by the charisma of the leader who personified the state. If Stalin had fled, that structure would have collapsed. If he remained and projected confidence, even if feigned, the system might endure long enough for Zhukov's desperate defense to succeed. The parade would serve as the tangible manifestation of that projected confidence. On November 7, 1941, in Red Square, snow fell steadily as soldiers marched in formation past Lenin's mausoleum. Tanks rumbled across the cobblestones. Artillery pieces were towed into position, and Stalin stood on the reviewing stand, visible to all, his iconic mustache prominent, clad in a simple military-style tunic, observing his army parade before him. The symbolic weight was immense. While German forces were positioned less than 30 miles away, and the distant rumble of artillery could be heard on quiet nights, Stalin conducted affairs as if under normal circumstances. The Revolution Day parade would proceed because the Soviet state was perceived as eternal, unshakable, destined for ultimate victory. However, it was the speech that held paramount significance. Stalin was not a naturally gifted orator. He spoke with a pronounced Georgian accent that he never shed. His voice was gruff, his delivery measured and deliberate. Yet he possessed a keen understanding of how to leverage history and tap into the profound currents of Russian identity that lay beneath the surface of communist ideology. He began by addressing the soldiers directly. Many of them would march from Red Square straight to the front lines. They were aware of this. He was aware of this. There was no pretense to be maintained. "Comrades," he stated, his voice amplified across the square through loudspeakers. "We are celebrating the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution in arduous circumstances. The perfidious assault by the German fascists and the war that has been imposed upon us have created a peril for our motherland." He did not downplay the crisis. He did not feign that all was well. He acknowledged the grim reality that every soldier in that square comprehended. Then he shifted his focus. "The adversary is merciless and implacable. He aims to seize our lands, tilled by our sweat, to seize our grain and oil, secured by our labor. He aims to reinstate the dominion of the landowners, to restore Tsarism, to annihilate national culture and the independent national existence of the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Moldavians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and the other free peoples of the Soviet Union." He was framing the conflict not as a defense of communism, but as a defense of Russian civilization itself. Subsequently, he delved into historical precedent, invoking the esteemed figures of Russia's past. "May the valiant figures of our great ancestors inspire you in this war," he declared, naming Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kuzma Minin, Dmitry Pozharsky, Alexander Suvorov, and Mikhail Kutuzov. These were not communist heroes, they were Russian heroes, medieval princes who had repelled invaders, generals who had defeated Napoleon. Stalin was aligning himself with the Soviet cause by drawing upon the most ancient and deeply ingrained identity available, one that transcended ideological boundaries. And then he delivered the unforgettable pronouncement, "Let the victorious banner of the great Lenin inspire you in this war. Death to the German invaders. The soldiers roared in response. They marched from Red Square directly to the front lines. Many perished within days. Yet they marched with the conviction that Stalin believed in victory, that the system would endure, that Moscow would stand firm. Behind the scenes, Stalin harbored considerably less certainty. In consultations with Zhukov and his other commanders, he candidly assessed the situation. They were outnumbered. The Germans possessed superior armaments, training, and coordination. Soviet forces were still reeling from the catastrophic events of the summer. Entire armies had been annihilated. The industrial capacity of Western Soviet territories had been lost or evacuated. They were fighting with their remaining resources. However, they possessed two distinct advantages. Firstly, the weather. The frigid conditions that inflicted misery upon all were proving calamari for the Germans. Their vehicles were not equipped for winter, and their soldiers lacked appropriate thermal attire. The Wehrmacht had anticipated a swift victory before winter's onset, and they were now paying the price for that miscalculation. German tanks refused to start. German soldiers suffered from frostbite. Supply lines were stretched to their absolute limit. Secondly, reinforcements. Stalin had received intelligence from Richard Sorge, a Soviet operative in Tokyo, indicating that Japan would not launch an offensive against the Soviet Union from the east. This crucial information enabled Stalin to redeploy divisions from Siberia and the Far East. These were fresh troops, trained for winter combat, equipped for frigid weather, and prepared to fight. Zhukov was concentrating these forces for a counteroffensive. But first, Moscow had to withstand the final German onslaught. Throughout November, the battle raged fiercely in the woodlands and fields surrounding Moscow. German forces advanced relentlessly. Soviet units held their ground, retreated, regrouped, and held once more. It was an arduous, brutal struggle, waged under conditions that rendered combat almost unbearable. Temperatures plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, then 30, then 40. Soldiers on both sides succumbed to exposure as much as to enemy fire. The Germans reached Khimki, a northern suburb of Moscow, on November 28th. They were close enough that their officers could perceive the gilded domes of the Kremlin. Some accounts claim German reconnaissance units reached within 12 miles of the city's core. They were fatigued, freezing, and inadequately supplied, but they were present. One more concerted push might prove decisive. Stalin received the reports in his office. The enemy was at the very gates. The city's outer defenses were holding, but precariously. Should the Germans breach them, there was nothing between them and the Kremlin but a few hastily assembled reserve units and the NKVD. He contacted Zhukov and inquired if the counteroffensive was ready. "Not yet," Zhukov replied. "Another week, perhaps less." The Siberian divisions were still being moved into position. They required additional time. Stalin informed him that he did not have another week. He had days at most. Zhukov assured him he would make it work. On December 5th, with German forces literally within sight of Moscow, the Soviet counteroffensive commenced. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped with winter attire and specialized cold weather gear, struck the exhausted German formations from multiple directions. The Germans, who had been led to believe the Soviets had exhausted their reserves and that a final push would seal their victory, suddenly found themselves confronted by 100,000 fresh troops. The German line wavered. Within days, it fractured completely. The Wehrmacht began a retreat from Moscow, not as an organized withdrawal, but bordering on a complete rout. Units abandoned equipment that failed to operate in the extreme cold. Soldiers discarded their weapons to accelerate their movement. The retreat continued through December and into January, pushing the Germans back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. The capital was secured. Stalin's audacious gamble had paid off. By remaining in Moscow and projecting an aura of confidence, even in the face of dire circumstances, he had sustained the Soviet system long enough for Zhukov to orchestrate a defense and launch a counterattack. The speech delivered at the parade, the invocation of Russian historical figures, the visible presence of the leader within the capital. All these elements contributed to averting the collapse that might have surrendered Moscow to the Germans without a climactic engagement. However, the cost was immense. The Battle of Moscow, from October through January, resulted in Soviet casualties ranging from 600,000 to over 1 million, depending on the methodology of enumeration. The Germans sustained between 250,000 and 400,000 losses. Entire Soviet divisions were decimated. Villages in the vicinity of Moscow were reduced to ashes and frozen corpses. The forests where combat raged bore the appearance of lunar landscapes. Trees were shattered by artillery fire, and the ground was churned into frozen mud. And Stalin knew that this was merely the beginning. The Germans had been halted at Moscow, but they had not been defeated. They still occupied vast swaths of Soviet territory. They still commanded millions of soldiers. They would regroup, resupply, and attack again. The war would continue for years. The casualties would climb into the tens of millions. But Moscow had held. And in holding Moscow, Stalin had preserved the Soviet Union's capacity to continue the fight. In the years following the war, Soviet propaganda would elevate the Battle of Moscow to the status of a legendary triumph. While Stalin was depicted as the ingenious commander who orchestrated the defense, the reality was far more intricate. Stalin's purges had weakened the Red Army and contributed to the catastrophic setbacks of 1941. His refusal to accept intelligence regarding the German invasion had left the Soviet Union unprepared. His interference in military operations frequently exacerbated difficult situations. Yet, at Moscow, during that moment of supreme crisis, he made the correct decision. He remained. He projected confidence. He held the system together, and he provided Zhukov with the requisite time and resources to organize a successful defense. The address he delivered on November 7th was not militarily significant. It did not alter the disposition of forces or modify the strategic landscape, but it profoundly impacted the psychological sphere. It conveyed to the Soviet populace and military that their leader believed in victory, that the state remained intact, and that the struggle would persist. In a system founded upon a cult of personality, the projection of inevitable triumph and the charisma of the leader, such a message held immense weight. Stalin understood power. He recognized that power was not solely a matter of tanks and divisions. It was inextricably linked to belief, to the perception of strength, and to the unwavering willingness of millions of individuals to persevere even when circumstances appeared utterly hopeless. At Moscow, when the enemy reached the city's periphery, when the metropolis teetered on the brink of panic, when even his own subordinates believed the cause was lost, Stalin uttered his characteristic refrain, the phrase that defined his entire approach to power. "We will hold. We will fight. We will win." And because he spoke with conviction, because he remained when he could have fled, because he projected an image of certainty amidst pervasive uncertainty, a sufficient number of people believed him for it to become a reality. The Battle of Moscow marked the first significant German defeat of the Second World War. It shattered the illusion of Wehrmacht invincibility. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union, even when pushed to the precipice, could fight back with tenacity. It established the paradigm for the remainder of the Eastern Front. Brutal, attritional warfare, in which the Soviets would trade territory and lives for time, absorbing German offensives before launching counterattacks when the enemy was depleted. Stalin would commit numerous further errors in the ensuing period. He would order disastrous offensives. He would refuse to sanction retreats when such a course was the only rational option. He would persist in ruling through terror, executing generals who faltered, and, at times, even those who achieved success. The Soviet triumph in the Second World War would exact a toll exceeding 27 million Soviet lives, a casualty rate that dwarfed that of any other participant in the conflict. However, at Moscow, in November and December of 1941, Stalin accomplished what was necessary. He remained in the capital when logic dictated departure. He projected confidence when the situation was dire. He delivered a speech invoking Russian heroes and Russian identity, enfolding the Soviet cause within something more ancient and profound than communist ideology. He queried Zhukov whether Moscow could be defended, accepted the candid assessment that it might not be possible, and nonetheless issued the order to attempt it. The Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin. They believed they stood on the verge of victory. And Stalin, standing on that reviewing platform in Red Square, as snow fell and soldiers marched past, declared to them and to all observing that they were mistaken. Moscow would hold, the Soviet Union would fight, and the war would continue. And he was correct.